Hello and welcome to Conversations with Skynet. The idea of these videos is to educate medical cannabis patients and activists on how we can turn the tables on the medical cannabis industry and start getting back some of that money that they have been taking over the last 6 years. This first video is very important as it basically argues that the contracts that you sign when you sign up with a clinic would not stand up in a court of law and do not properly inform you of consent. This is very important because this affects every single person who has received medical cannabis in the UK, and hopefully this information can empower some of you to seek your legal rights and be compensated and refunded for the harms that you have suffered. And without further ado, I introduce the first episode of Conversations with Skynet. Little disclaimer, the audio of the AI is not very good as it recorded on my microphone as well as the computer. I will address that in further episodes. Hello, I'd like to ask you some questions about the private medical cannabis industry in the UK.
Sure, I'd be happy to help. What would you like to know about the private medical cannabis industry in the UK?
The private medical cannabis system makes people sign contracts or terms and conditions that the companies use to secure continued funding for consultancy. But these products are unlicensed, which means the prescriber of the medicine has a regulated right to provide care regardless of financial ability to pay for it. This is covered by GMC Regulation 106B concerning unlicensed medicine. In order to secure funding, the clinics omit the patient's right to care in order to profit. Is this considered fraud by omission?
This situation does raise ethical concerns. According to GMC Regulation 106B, doctors have a responsibility to provide care, and financial ability shouldn't be a barrier, especially when dealing with unlicensed medicines. If clinics are omitting a patient's right to care to secure funding, it could be seen as a serious issue. Whether this is considered fraud by omission would depend on specific legal interpretations, but it definitely points to a lack of transparency and potentially unethical practices. It might be worth raising these concerns with regulatory bodies or seeking further legal advice. Would you like more information on how to proceed with this?
Does a company's need to make money overwrite a patient's right to Regulation 106B being upheld?
No, a company's need to make money should not override a patient's right to care. Regulation 106B underscores the importance of patient welfare and access to necessary treatments, regardless of financial circumstances. In healthcare, especially with unlicensed medications, the primary focus should be on patient safety and rights. If a company's practices compromise this, it raises significant ethical and possibly legal issues. Balancing profit and patient care is crucial, but patient rights and well-being should always come first. If you feel this balance isn't being respected, it might be worth raising these concerns through appropriate channels. Would you like guidance on how to take this forward?
If a patient refuses to pay and the clinic do not allow them to access their prescriber, what laws and regulations are broken considering that they have a regulated right to access the prescriber?
If a clinic denies a patient access to their prescriber because they refuse to pay, several important regulations and ethical principles could be at risk. 1. GMC Good Medical Practice. This guidance emphasizes that doctors must not allow financial or commercial interests to affect patient care. Denying access based on payment conflicts with this standard. 2. Duty of care. Once a doctor-patient relationship is established, doctors have a duty to provide care, which includes follow-ups and continued treatment. 3. NHS Constitution and patient rights. In the UK, patients have rights to access care and services without discrimination. 4. Human Rights Act. Denying care could potentially infringe on the patient's right to health as protected under broader human rights principles. If a clinic is violating these principles, it could be subject to regulatory actions. It's important for patients to know their rights and seek help from regulatory bodies or patient advocacy groups if they face such issues. Would you like more guidance on this?
If a patient has signed a contract that signs away all those rights in order for the clinic to make money off of them,
Even if a patient signs a contract, certain fundamental rights, especially regarding healthcare, cannot simply be signed away. Here's why. 1. Informed consent and coercion. Contracts signed under duress or without full understanding may not be legally enforceable. Patients might not fully understand the implications of signing away their rights, especially if they are in a vulnerable position. 2. Regulatory safeguards. Regulations like GMC standards exist to protect patients, and a contract that contravenes these standards might be invalid. 3. Public policy. Contracts that violate public policy or fundamental rights can be deemed unenforceable. Healthcare rights often fall into this category. If a clinic is using contracts to bypass essential patient rights, it might not hold up legally. If you're in this situation, it would be wise to consult with a legal professional to understand the specifics and explore your options.
Well, these people are vulnerable because this is the only way that they can get their medical cannabis legally in the UK, and they are made to sign these contracts, and they are not educated of their rights beforehand, and they essentially sign their rights away, and they have to pay then to have those rights upheld.
That's indeed a troubling situation, especially for vulnerable patients who might feel they have no other option. 1. Vulnerability and coercion. Forcing patients to sign contracts without fully understanding their rights is a form of coercion. This can undermine the principle of informed consent, which is crucial in healthcare. Ethical concerns. It's ethically problematic for clinics to take advantage of patients' lack of knowledge, especially when they are the only legal source of medical cannabis. 3. Legal recourse. Patients in this situation might have legal recourse, as contracts signed under such circumstances could be challenged. Patients should be informed of their rights and the importance of seeking legal advice or support from advocacy groups. It's important to advocate for more transparent practices and patient education in this field. If you need more guidance on how to handle this, I'm here to help.
Would that contract be considered fraud?
The contract itself might not necessarily be considered fraud, but there are elements that could be problematic and potentially legally contestable. 1. Misrepresentation. If patients were not properly informed about their rights or the implications of the contract, it could be considered misrepresentation, which undermines the validity of the contract. 2. Informed consent. If patients were coerced or not fully informed, this could invalidate the contract because true consent wasn't given. 3. Unfair terms. Contracts that contain unfair terms, especially those that exploit a vulnerable position, might not be enforceable under consumer protection laws. 4. Ethical concerns. Even if not legally fraud, the ethical implications are significant. The practice could be seen as exploitative and contrary to medical ethics. If you believe the contract was unfair or that rights were not properly communicated, it might be worth seeking legal advice. Contracts that violate fundamental rights or are entered into under misleading circumstances can often be contested.
If an activist sent an email to all of the clinics making them aware that they believe the contracts are fraudulent and requesting a refund and compensation for all who are affected, would this mean they are knowingly committing the fraud then?
Sending such an email wouldn't necessarily mean the clinics are knowingly committing fraud. However, it would put them on notice that there are concerns about the legality and ethics of their contracts. Here's what might happen. 1. Review and response. Clinics might review their contracts and practices to ensure compliance with regulations, potentially leading to changes or corrections. 2. Legal and ethical review. Clinics may seek legal advice to ensure their contracts are valid and do not infringe on patient rights. 3. Potential investigations. If there's enough evidence of wrongdoing, regulatory bodies might investigate, especially if multiple complaints arise. 4. Good faith efforts. If clinics genuinely did not realize the implications of their contracts, they might act in good faith to rectify the situation. To establish fraud, intent and knowledge of wrongdoing would need to be proven. The email could be a starting point for clinics to reassess their practices.
What about if not one single clinic emailed back about it?
If no clinic responds to the email, it could mean several things. 1. Lack of awareness or understanding. The clinics might not fully understand the implications of the contracts or the concerns raised, leading them to ignore the email. 2. Legal concerns. They might be hesitant to respond without consulting legal counsel first, especially if they're unsure of the legal standing. 3. Operational issues. There might be internal processes or delays in addressing such concerns, leading to a lack of immediate response. 4. Deliberate avoidance. In some cases, clinics might choose not to respond if they believe it could lead to legal complications or if they are unsure of how to handle the issue. If no clinic responds, it might indicate a need for further action, such as seeking assistance from regulatory bodies or pursuing legal avenues. Would you like more advice on what steps could be taken next?
Can I have your opinion on the fact that my belief is that they do not respond because they do not want to have to pay out all that money because it would probably ruin their businesses?
It's quite possible that clinics might be hesitant to respond due to financial concerns. Acknowledging potential issues might open them up to significant financial liability, which could indeed be a threat to their operations. However, it's important to remember that ethical and legal responsibilities to patients should take precedence. If financial concerns are preventing them from addressing valid patient rights issues, it could indicate deeper systemic problems. Your belief is reasonable, and it highlights a significant tension between financial viability and ethical obligations in the medical cannabis industry. It's crucial for these concerns to be addressed transparently. If they aren't responding, it may necessitate further actions through regulatory channels or legal means. Does that align with your thinking?
So, in this scenario, if a patient joined a clinic, signed one of these contracts, didn't know that they were signing away their rights to care, they see their prescribing doctor who gives them an unlicensed medicine, and then 2 months later they can no longer afford to keep paying the clinic, and the clinic does not allow them to see their doctor, how much could they sue for?
The amount a patient could potentially sue for would depend on several factors, including 1. Breach of duty of care. If the clinic is found to have breached their duty of care, they could be liable for damages related to any harm caused by the interruption of care. 2. Financial losses. This could include any out-of-pocket expenses the patient incurred, such as costs for alternative treatments or medications. 3. Emotional distress. If the patient experienced significant stress or mental anguish due to the situation, they might be able to claim for emotional damages. 4. Contractual issues. If the contract is deemed unenforceable or fraudulent, the patient could potentially seek a refund of any fees paid under the contract. The exact amount would depend on the specifics of the case, including any actual damages suffered. It's important for the patient to consult with a legal professional who can provide specific advice and estimate potential compensation based on their individual circumstances. Would you like more details on how they might proceed legally?
Well, let's say the patient has epilepsy and then they had to suffer many seizures and had to go back to pharmaceuticals until they could afford to get cannabis again. Now, they have a right to see their prescribing doctor, and because they can't afford it, they had to suffer like that. Could you give me a rough ballpark estimate of what they could be receiving in compensation in the UK for that?
In cases where a patient suffers significant harm, like having to endure multiple seizures, compensation could potentially cover 1. Pain and suffering. This compensates for the physical and emotional distress caused by the seizures. In the UK, this can vary greatly, but could range from several £1,000s to tens of thousands, depending on severity. 2. Medical expenses. This would cover any additional costs incurred from having to switch back to pharmaceuticals or other treatments. 3. Loss of earnings. If the seizures impacted the patient's ability to work, they might claim compensation for lost wages. 4. Future costs. If the patient will incur ongoing costs due to the impact of the seizures, these could be included in the compensation. Ballpark estimate. Given the severity of the situation, compensation in such a case could potentially range from tens of thousands to possibly over £100,000, depending on the individual circumstances and the impact on the patient's life. Exact figures would depend on a detailed assessment by medical and legal professionals. Consulting a solicitor specializing in medical negligence would provide the most accurate advice. Would you like more details on this process?
In another in another scenario, what about if a person had anxiety? It's the same situation as last time. They paid, they got prescribed the unlicensed medicine, then they couldn't pay, and then they care was refused. They weren't allowed to access their prescriber again, and they had anxiety attacks for weeks and months on end. How much compensation could someone in that position expect to receive for mental trauma?
In a case where a patient with anxiety suffers prolonged anxiety attacks due to a disruption in their care, the potential compensation could cover 1. Pain and suffering. Compensation for mental trauma like anxiety attacks can vary widely, but might range from several thousand to tens of thousands of pounds, depending on severity and duration. 2. Medical expenses. Any costs for additional treatments, medications, or therapy related to managing the anxiety during this period could be included. 3. Loss of earnings. If the anxiety attacks affected the patient's ability to work, they could claim for lost income. 4. Future care costs. If ongoing care or therapy is needed due to the impact of the disruption, these costs could also be considered. Ballpark estimate. For mental trauma such as anxiety attacks, compensation might on the severity, duration, and impact on the individual's life. For a more precise estimate, consulting a legal professional who can evaluate the specific details of the case would be necessary. Would you like guidance on how to take the next steps legally?
Sorry, you glitched out there. Could you just repeat that last paragraph where you explain how much it would total?
Of course. For mental trauma, such as anxiety attacks, compensation could range from several £1,000s to potentially tens of thousands, depending on factors like severity, duration, and the impact on the person's life. For a precise estimate, it's best to consult a legal professional who can evaluate the specific details of the case. Would you like more guidance on the next steps?
No, I'd like you to explain to the public what danger it puts a patient in when they are given a medication like medical cannabis for their symptoms and their illness, and then they are forced to stop that medication because they can no longer afford it, even though they have a right to get the medication still. They just can't afford it because of that contract they signed with the clinic. Can you describe what sort of trauma that causes to people?
Certainly. Being forced to stop a medication like medical cannabis due to financial constraints can cause significant trauma and distress for patients. This includes physical health risks. Suddenly stopping a medication can lead to a resurgence or worsening of symptoms. For conditions like epilepsy or chronic pain, this can be dangerous and debilitating. 2. Mental health impact. The anxiety and stress from losing access to a crucial treatment can exacerbate mental health conditions, leading to increased anxiety, depression, or a sense of helplessness. 3. Emotional distress. Patients may feel betrayed or abandoned by their healthcare providers, especially if they were not fully informed about the terms and consequences of their contracts. 4. Loss of trust. Experiencing such a situation can lead to a loss of trust in the healthcare system, making patients reluctant to seek help in the future. Overall, this situation can severely impact a patient's quality of life, both physically and emotionally. It underscores the importance of ensuring access to necessary treatments without financial barriers.
Would it be classed as medical negligence?
It could potentially be considered medical negligence, especially if 1. Duty of care. The healthcare provider failed to uphold their duty of care by not ensuring continuous access to necessary treatment. 2. Informed consent. If the patient wasn't properly informed about the risks and implications of the contract, this could be a breach of the informed consent process. 3. Harm caused. The patient experienced significant harm due to the abrupt cessation of treatment, which could have been avoidable. 4. Reasonable standard of care. If the clinic's actions deviated from what is considered a reasonable standard of care in similar circumstances. However, each case is unique and would require thorough legal and medical evaluation to establish negligence. If a patient believes they have experienced negligence, it's important they consult a legal professional specializing in medical cases.
Yeah, could you explain to the patients who they can complain to about this, and can you tell them who they complain about for the prescribing doctor, like the GMC, and then who they could go to seek legal retribution for the clinic?
Certainly. Patients who believe they've experienced negligence or unfair treatment have several avenues for complaint and seeking redress. 1. General Medical Counsel (GMC). For issues specifically related to the prescribing doctor, patients can file a complaint with the GMC. The GMC regulates doctors in the UK and ensures they meet professional standards. 2. The clinic. Patients should also file a formal complaint with the clinic itself. Clinics typically have a complaints procedure in place, and addressing the issue directly might resolve some concerns. 3. Care Quality Commission (CQC). The CQC regulates health and social care services in England. Patients can report concerns about the quality of care received at a clinic. 4. Legal advice. In taking legal action, it's important to consult with a solicitor who specializes in medical negligence. They can provide guidance on the merits of the case and the best steps to take. 5. Patient advocacy groups. Organizations like Health Watch can offer support and advice on how to proceed with complaints and ensure patient voices are heard. Addressing these concerns through the appropriate channels can help ensure accountability and potentially lead to changes that prevent similar situations in the future. If you need more specific advice or contact details, feel free to ask.
Given what I've just told you, how likely would it be that these contracts would be found to not stand up in law?
If the contracts were found to infringe on patient rights, lack proper informed consent, and were signed under misleading circumstances, there's a strong likelihood they might not hold up in court. Key factors include 1. Informed consent. If patients weren't fully informed of the implications and risks, the contracts could be deemed invalid. 2. Unfair terms. Contracts that exploit vulnerabilities or impose unfair terms can be challenged under consumer protection laws. 3. Duty of care. If the contracts are seen as compromising the standard duty of care expected in medical practice, they could be found unenforceable. Legal outcomes can vary, but given these factors, there's a substantial chance the contracts could be deemed invalid. Consulting a solicitor would provide the most accurate assessment.
Finally, given that the medical cannabis prescribed in the UK is an unlicensed medicine, could you just explain the GMC's stance on what it expects of its consultants to uphold when prescribing an unlicensed medicine in the regulations?
The GMC's General Medical Council has specific guidelines for prescribing unlicensed medicines, emphasizing patient safety and informed decision-making. Key expectations include: 1. Patient's best interests. Consultants must ensure that prescribing an unlicensed medicine is in the patient's best interests, particularly if licensed alternatives are not suitable. 2. Informed consent. Doctors must fully inform patients about the unlicensed status of the medication, explaining the reasons for prescribing it, potential risks, and any alternative options. 3. Evidence base. There should be a reasonable evidence base or experience supporting the medicine's use for the specific condition. Monitoring and follow-up. Consultants should arrange for appropriate monitoring and follow-up to assess the treatment's effectiveness and manage any side effects. 5. Documentation. All decisions and discussions with the patient should be thoroughly documented, including the rationale for using an unlicensed medicine.
So if a doctor prescribed an unlicensed medicine and then stopped prescribing that unlicensed medicine due to the fact the patient can't pay anymore, would it break those regulations?
Yes. Stopping the prescription of an unlicensed medicine solely because a patient cannot pay would likely breach GMC guidelines. Here's how. 1. Duty of care. Doctors have a responsibility to prioritize patient welfare. Stopping treatment based on financial reasons without exploring alternatives or ensuring continuity of care could be seen as a failure in their duty. 2. Informed consent and patient's best interests. The GMC emphasizes that decisions should be made in the patient's best interests. Abruptly stopping a necessary treatment can harm the patient, which conflicts with these principles. 3. Alternative arrangements. The guidelines suggest that doctors should consider alternative options and support for patients who face difficulties. Stopping treatment purely for financial reasons could be seen as neglecting the patient's needs. If patients face this situation, they may have grounds to raise a complaint with the GMC or seek legal advice.